Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm Mitch Resnick. I'm a professor here at the Media Lab, and it's wonderful to welcome my longtime friend and colleague, Turkle, to one of the series of MLTalks here at the Media Lab, both for our local audience and also streaming online. Actually, I first met Sherry in 1983, 33 years ago, when I came to MIT for a one-year fellowship, and I never left. So before that, I'd been working as a science journalist, and I came here for one-year fellowship to learn more about some of the new issues that were rising in the world of science and technology. And during that year, I took a few courses and met a few people that ended up changing my life. I took a computer science course that Hal Abelson taught, and that led me to think about computer programming in a new way, to see it not just as a way to make machines do something, but I realized that programming was a new way of representing ideas and communicating ideas. And I participated in a seminar with Seymour Papert, one of the founding members of the faculty here at the Media Lab. And Seymour helped me start to see children in a totally new way and to see learning in a totally new way. And he started me on a lifelong journey of designing new technologies to support creative learning experiences for children. And I took a course that was taught by Sherry that looked at what Sherry called the subjective side of computing. And it helped me understand and appreciate that computers and new technologies weren't just for accomplishing tasks and getting things done, but also engaged us in thinking about ourselves in new ways and relating to other people in new ways. And those experiences, it's not an understatement to say, fundamentally changed my life. And I ended up staying here and have continued to explore those ideas over the last 33 years, some of the times co-teaching courses with Sherry. So it's great to have her here to talk about some of her ideas, how they've evolved over the years. A few months ago, Sherry published her latest book, Reclaiming Conversation. So that's what triggered this ML talk. But I thought it might be better, rather than just focusing on that, to take a bit of a journey historically from over Sherry's evolution from the time she came here to MIT. I should just mention, as we're talking, since this is being live streamed, if people want to tweet, there's a hashtag MLTalks if people want to tweet, and later on we'll take questions both from the Twitter feed and from the local audience here. So when I came in 1983, it was a few years after Sherry arrived at MIT, where she had gotten her PhD jointly in sociology and psychology. And she came to MIT at a very special time when the digital culture was just starting to emerge. It was just starting to emerge a bit in the world, and things that we now take for granted and we see around us all the time, certainly here at the Media Lab, but around the world, we're just starting to emerge at MIT. So Sherry came somewhat as an anthropologist exploring this new culture that was emerging from MIT. So I thought it'd be good to start out by hearing a little bit about the initial part of your time at MIT, the journey at MIT, and the experiences you had as you landed in this new, maybe somewhat alien culture.
Yeah, well, I actually was hired to come to MIT. I had just finished a book on psychoanalysis in the larger culture, which had focused on how psychoanalytic ideas start from being part of a psychoanalytic movement, but then really become part of how regular people who aren't in psychoanalysis or who've never read a word of Freud start to think about their past and their presence and their possibilities for change, how a psychoanalytic movement becomes a psychoanalytic culture. And the idea was that ideas from artificial intelligence, which were kind of part of seminar rooms and the world of science, were just in the late 70s, early 80s, starting to become part of how everybody were starting to think about their minds, because for the first time, people were starting to get their hands on computers. So, for example, I'd be teaching a class on Freud, and I would be talking about Freudian slips. And somebody in the class would be saying, well, no, that's an information processing error. That's not a Freudian slip, and here's how it works. Or
just slipped a bit somewhere.
Just slipped the bits. People would be talking about debugging a program in terms of changing, how they think about something. Or people would talk about, don't interrupt me, I need to clear my buffer, when they wanted to describe a mental terrain that needed to be cleared and crossed in order to reach interactive processing potential. So these ideas from computation and some from AI were really starting to trickle out into how certainly people at the Institute, thought about their lives. And then I met Seymour Papert and began to get involved in children learning to program and how the language of programming in fact became a language for self-reflection. In other words, if a machine can be programmed that way, what does that mean about me as a machine? In what degree am I like a machine or different than a machine? And I became fascinated with the question of how computers and the whole computational world was kind of offering a mirror to our way of thinking about ourselves. So that was very much the context for my first years at MIT.
In fact, your book was called The Second Self.
My first book was called The Second Self, and part of it was about, I studied hackers, I studied hobbyists, I studied AI people, and I studied kids who I was introducing to computer toys and games for the first time, and their main question of these games was, is it alive? Because usually children traditionally had thought of whether or not something was alive by whether or not it could move from point A to point B on its own in terms of motion. But here were objects that could talk back to you, that could spell, that could do tic-tac-toe, that could solve problems, and whether or not they were moving in terms of physical motion seemed so off the point, because really it was more their emotion, it was more their psychological motion that was very much to the point. So a category of almost alive or sort of alive spontaneously emerged as these children talked about these objects, and that of course fascinated me as a psychologist and someone who was studying the subjective side, as you say, of what computers were meaning for kids and for the culture as a whole. I think we're still there. I think we're still talking about our machines as sort of alive.
Yeah, I remember one thing that struck me from back then. You were talking about how as kids growing up, who they compare themselves with. That kids had grown up seeing themselves like animals, but they were sort of smarter animals, or animals that had different types of thoughts. And now they saw themselves more like machines, but they were ones who had feelings and could express emotions, unlike the machine. So it shifted the way that they framed themselves based on what they saw around them.
Actually, it was a very interesting time because Mitch is right that in that first period, I described what I called a romantic reaction to the computer presence. That there was a sense that if you compare yourself to a machine, then we are the feeling machines. And that was kind of the position the children took. The phrase that came out was simulated thinking may be thinking, but simulated feeling is never feeling, simulated love is never love, is the way I kind of characterized the position from the late 70s through the late 80s in that romantic reaction to the early computers. And that has kind of shifted. I'm sure we'll get into that as we go through the history of my work, because with the rise of sociable robots, for example, machines that are trying to have feelings, when children meet those, they sort of start to align themselves with machines as having feelings, and then, now what makes people special is more kind of up for grabs. So you kind of start to edge out that romantic reaction and are left in something I call the robotic moment, where we are more likely to see ourselves in a new kinship with objects.
So in some ways, it's how people imagine themselves, but then also increasingly how they relate to others, especially a few years later as the internet, started to proliferate. and you started looking at, as people were interacting on the internet, the ways that that changed. Again, on issues around self and identity.
Yeah.
And that was something you really looked at in Life on the Screen of, and in fact, you started to be called the cyber shrink and
Right.
the tech Freud and
Well, you called me the Margaret Mead of Silicon.
So
Mitch gave me the best.
So it's sort of, as people were interacting, and you sort of studied the way that
Yeah.
people played with identity through their interactions with others online.
Yes.
And sort of it became a new sort of playground. So it wasn't just shifting the way people thought about themselves, but also giving a space for people to start playing and trying out and exploring issues of identity.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that my first work here was really one-on-one with the computer, because that was the most pertinent relationship, was one-on-one with the computer. And that was in the late 70s through the mid-80s. And then by the mid-80s, I was starting to study people online and discovered this whole new world of kind of the identity explorations in the online life, and began to focus my attention more and to the worlds of identity play that were possible. I called the second book Life on the Screen, and that meant life on the screen, identity in the age of the internet. And that's where I studied. I was fascinated by multi-user dungeons, those games where you would go on and assume an avatar and really get a chance to play out the self you imagined yourself to be, whether it was in gender or personality or time or space, and how people could really play out these kinds of
When
worlds.
a lot of people had great concern as that started to emerge,
Right.
but I think you saw it as a way for people to be experimenting and playfully exploring.
Yeah, I mean, I really was kind of, I live in many different intellectual worlds, and I lived in a world of psychologists who were saying, oh, that's just fantasy, and I was saying, this is like the most important kinds of fantasy that we all need to be studying and honoring and respecting. The kinds of fantasies that are being played out here are, deeply compelling and central to culture, and it's not like that's just anything. That's central to, I wanted to bring the study of the internet and the study of these online experiences deeper into the heart of what psychologists were studying. And I found that a kind of tough sell. I mean, it's hard to bring yourself back to those days, but at the time, because the reason I say it's a little bit hard, because I think now I'm a little bit positioned as an internet critic. In those days, I think I saw myself and was perceived as the person who was the psychologist trying to sell, please psychologists, please humanists, study the internet. This is something happening that needs humanists, psychologists, clinical people, this is what we need to be applying all of those skills to. That was kind of my mission, and trying to make it interesting and alive for that community.
Yeah. And I think in your work, you're often pointing out some of the ironies that arise
Right.
as technologies enter our lives.
Right.
And I think some of it at that point was that people saw the computer as the ultimate rational, logical machine.
Right.
But you saw how it was opening up a playground for people to be exploring in many different ways that were far from the sort of the logical, rational. And it opened up a space for those type of exploration.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And open up new ways for thinking. I know another aspect of the work, that from the beginning was that sort of opening up different ways of knowing. That it wasn't. I think a lot of people saw the computer again, and worried that it might just lock in people to they'll just learn to think in this very logical way.
Right.
But I think you co-authored a paper with Seymour Papert about epistemological pluralism, a mouthful of a title, about how it could support a diversity in ways not just thinking about ourselves, but thinking about knowledge.
Absolutely. That paper was really a turning point in my work and thinking, because it was based on years of studying children working with Logo. And of course, there were many projects. Mitch was part of several of these projects, of teaching programming to kids, and seeing all of the many different ways in which really that was a way of exploring identity and exploring subject matter, and so much that programming came alive and made kids come alive. And my part in those studies was that I would do psychological tests on the children and really track the ways in which they were approaching the programming. And I discovered that depending really on who they were in their deeper psychology, they would approach programming in different ways, which is not surprising. Programming was kind of Rorschach for deeper things. It was a new expressive medium. It was a Rorschach for deeper things about the individual. So that paper was a way to try to, again, speak to both the computer science community and the psychological and humanistic community and say, look, you have a new expressive medium here that should be treated as one and not just as a kind of rote technical subject. You have a new way to let people express who they are as people. You have a new way to study who they are as people, and we should be exploiting and exploring that. I've been very sad that, I think that it's very hard for people to run with that as much as I think they should have.
Yeah, and I think those issues remain just as important today as when that paper was
today.
by 25 years ago.
Yeah, just as important today as now, and it's very hard for people to run with that.
Why do you think that is?
I think that there's something about this technology where having the box closed and seeing it as something with apps that gets things done has been extremely seductive both in education and in everyday life. The appification of this technology has been delicious, irresistible, and I think that goes somewhat against the grain of seeing this technology as really an expressive medium. And I think both of those things are true. It's a world of apps for getting things done, but it also is a world of expressing yourself individually. And I think that for some reason, keeping those two things very much in the forefront has not been easy for people.
Yeah, and I do think, as you mentioned, the way people have perceived your work did start from technology enthusiast or to a skeptic. In fact, I think in one of the reviews of your latest book, I think you referred to as a skeptic who was once a believer or something like that. But I think you've often said that it's partly because of the way technology has evolved and where technology has taken us. So one of it is the ways technology is now entering people's lives. Or earlier when you talked about certain ways people relate to when you were talking about the affective robots. Or as technology evolved in new directions, it's led you to start to think about some things in different ways. Yeah. So maybe you can say a little about that evolution.
Well, I mean, I think that I have certain values that I came to this world with. I'm trained as a psychodynamically trained psychologist. I'm psychoanalytically trained. I'm an ethnographer, a field worker. So I come to the study of all of this with both humanistic values and as a developmental psychologist with certain ideas about what nurtures intimacy, empathy, connection. I see a bunch of kids collaborating and discussing and talking about themselves as they program a computer. All the buttons of a psychologist who's interested in connection and empathy and communication, all the positive buttons are pushed, and I'm all in. I see two people having lunch, and they're both on their phones, and they're not talking to each other. All the buttons of whether they're of intimacy, empathy, communication are tamped down. So as the two experiences, actually both very much experiences that I had while teaching in the Media Lab, the two experiences that I had that made me look more critically at the computer culture were both experiences here. And one was realizing in a class that I taught with Mitch, the wearable group, the early wearable group, I think it was, what was his name? Steve Mann, came to speak to our class very early in his investigations, and here was a brilliant pioneer who basically wore the web on him. He had glasses where he could have for a screen. He had a backpack that had his computer. He had his keyboard in his pocket, and he was basically with all that stuff on him. And he would say that people would, not know whether he was disabled and whether they should give him a seat or treat him as a disabled person. But basically, he had pretty much what we all have when we're carrying around our phones. I mean, he could see. He was on the web all the time. And when he spoke about his experiences, it just flashed to me that this was going to be miniaturized and that within a short period of time, we would all be wearing the web on us. And we would all, and in speaking to him, he said the greatest thing about it is that he could be with me but also sort of checking my CV while he was talking to me. And he could be with me and also elsewhere, enhancing his experience of me and learning about me and reading my latest paper. And I realized that this divided attention, which for him was an enhancement, also meant that we were together and elsewhere. And that soon we would all be able to be together and elsewhere. And that investigation of what it would be to be together and elsewhere all the time, to have our technology always on and always on us, led me to write Alone Together, which is, Mitch has all of my books here, it's kind of fun. But it
Actually,
led
it's only
me,
some of them. I left out a few. Sherry pointed out earlier that I was
only
missing
some
a few.
of them, right. But it led me to write Alone Together, which was really an exploration of what it meant to live in a world of always on and always on you communication, that we're of psychologically what that would do to us. And that, that was not so much criticism as a kind of cautionary tale of what divided attention means. But that really began in that classroom when he came and explained the beauty of being there, but really as he was there, he was also elsewhere. I mean, he kind of said that.
So it was divided attention, but also I think with the subtitle of the book was something like relying more on technology, expecting more of technology and less of each other.
Yes, that was the subtitle. Why we expect more of technology and less of each other. And the second experience, so the second experience was also one I had here in Rodney Brooks's laboratory, where Rodney showed me COG, and the way in which, by pretty simple gestures, COG was one of the first sociable robots, sociable in the sense that it could do things like mirror your motions and track your attention. Do things that Mitch can do, mirror your emotions, track your attention, follow you and know that it was you and not someone else. That how quickly, when I visited COG along with a colleague, the two of us were vying for its attention during the visit. So we came in to see COG, and I actually was there with Chris Langton, one of the founders of Artificial Life, a very sophisticated computer scientist. Both of us knew what COG didn't know. And we didn't think that COG was alive, or, we knew what was going on. And very soon in this visit, we were competing for COG's attention. Now, it turns out that he was wearing a red shirt and I wasn't, so I didn't have a chance because COG was programmed to go for the red shirt. But I actually was like, I was like making an effort, wanting the attention of this robot. And I realized the incredible power that even very simple sociable robotics had, and how quickly one forgets everything one knows about what's really going on and how one really feels that one wants to be wanted by an object that pushes our Darwinian buttons in the sense that we feel that anything that responds in that way sort of must be one of us. And those were the two kinds of experiences that led me to write Alone Together. That there's a sort of, we become more invested in our machines, from the Tamagotchis right through Cog and Kismet and beyond, and we become increasingly on the web, more invested in.
And I think you point out that, and part of the problem is if people see these growing capabilities and the ways that we react to it, but then see it as serving some replacement roles and sort of taking over roles that typically had been human interaction roles, and that even if it might seem that it could be useful to have this companion, but if it's taking the place of something else, what is it that's lost in that exchange?
Yeah, well, I went on this kind of odyssey studying the world of sociable robotics. So Alone Together is partly about the new world of social media, and so it's about sort of the rise of the Facebook sensibility, which I try to capture by calling it, and I share, therefore I am, new psychological mindset. And it's also about the rise of sociable robotics as a way of thinking about what robots should be doing for us. And I do take it from the Tamagotchi on. What concerned me is how quickly people moved from this is better than nothing in terms of companionship to it's better, and actually it's better than anything. And I'll give you an example. In interviewing about Aibo, people would say, I'm allergic, and my dad is allergic, so an Aibo is better than not having a dog at all. Aibo was one of the early robotic dog, and you could program it to stay a puppy, kind of a little puppy, growing little puppy in its behaviors. So first it was, I love Aibo because I'm allergic. And then it was, people love puppies. So it's really better than a dog because it will always stay a puppy. And then it's better than any dog you could ever have because it will never die. And it will never leave you alone, and it will never die. So in child after child, and grown-up after grown-up, I'm an empiricist, I do these interviews, I was hearing about better than nothing becomes better than something becomes better than anything. And I think that movement in technology, from something being posed as a kind of obvious addition if you don't have anything, to, well, it's better sometimes, to somehow it ends up being better than anything that life can provide, is just something we have to be very attentive to. And that really was, I think, the major critical theme.
Yeah, and I think it really resonated with me because I think I see some similar things since I do work in the field of learning and education, and people are trying to have all types of new online tutoring systems and information that you can get access to and instruction online. And again, that can be better than nothing. If I don't have access to someone to talk to, or a mentor, or a teacher that I can be learning from, going on and getting some online instruction could be a useful thing. I see it as somewhat similar. It was great when I was growing up. There was an encyclopedia in the living room, and it was great to go and get access to that. But I wouldn't have wanted the encyclopedia instead of other learning experiences I had. Right. So I do feel the same thing in education often happens, that once something becomes available, it is useful, but then for a variety, sometimes it's for economic reasons it starts displacing, or sometimes because people prefer that they think it's going to be neater, easier, and it slides in place of some of the more complexities of the human relationship, but which leads to a richer learning environment or richer relationships and some of the things that you're thinking about.
That's just exactly well put. I think we have to ask ourselves, I think one of my current questions is this metaphor of friction-free or things being easier? Now we have the fantasy that we'll somehow put on virtual reality goggles and we'll be there without having to be there. The idea of virtual reality, Chris Milk calls it an empathy machine, an empathy generator, compassion generator. Really? Is compassion that easy? What is this fantasy that virtual reality will make compassion that easy? What is it really to be empathic and compassionate? Is this? I was talking to somebody who says, "Yeah, that's compassion on the cheap." I just think there's something about how easily we want this easier way, and we have fantasized about somehow technology giving us an easier way out of the messiness of what really human relationships are about.
And it seems especially a problem if it's acting as a replacement as opposed to an enhancement or an addition or an additional perspective or another way of looking at it.
But I think that's...
But it's sliding into being replacement.
But I think that's the question for, I hope in the conversation, that can be the focus of a discussion. That's the discussion that I want to have continually is what is there about technology that makes us as designers and as people who care so deeply about it move so fast to let's make it replace. I think you see that. Mitch brought up, online education as a great example. Why so quickly to replace? First we're talking about enhancing and an extra wonderful thing, and then all of a sudden it's better than anything that face-to-face can provide. And I feel the same way about, I just yesterday was speaking at a school where every kid has to have an iPad, and all of a sudden the whole curriculum's on it. And all of a sudden there aren't any books in the library. Really? It's cheaper, but really no library?
See, that's what but here's where I might not be so sure.
Yeah?
Because for me, if it's a matter of just getting access to the information, for me, whether that information comes in ink on paper or on the screen, I'm not so sure for me that makes a difference. If it's displacing some other human interaction I'm having, then it's a challenge. And I can see if part of the point is I'm missing meeting people in the stacks of the library and some of the social interaction, that I worry is lost. But I don't worry so much about just changing the form if it's just getting access to the information. Well,
I think we have to be a little bit more conservative about media shifts. Yeah. I have a funny story. I think we do read differently online and on paper. And I think the jury is out about whether we want complete replacement. I have a daughter who's now 25, and her first year at her kindergarten, she went to a private school in Massachusetts, and private kindergarten begins, and I get a notice from the school, all the parents did, that just to notice that this is the first year that from this year forward, there will be no cursive writing taught at this school. It's over, we don't need it, keyboarding instead, no cursive writing, your child will not learn cursive writing. So it was like a really fancy school, and I'd really tried very hard to get her into the school. It was like a great coup, she was in the school. It was like, okay, no cursive writing, she'll be keyboarding, okay. So, okay, but turns out all these new studies are showing that cursive writing is like the activity that lights up your brain. And 25 years later, I'm looking at my splendid, magnificent child and thinking, what would she be if she had been exposed to cursive writing? Just saying that, just saying that before, that kind of gentle with the throwing out the books.
And I do think always looking at the trade-offs, because it's also true that when people started writing, I do believe their memories became worse.
Yes.
So there was definitely a downside of learning to write.
Right.
Overall, it's probably a good trade-off, but we definitely did lose something.
Right.
But I think you're right, we always should be looking at those trade-offs.
Just kind of gentle with, when it's a necessary, when you have kind of a necessary, we need to end the, if there needs to be, in order for progress to happen, the end of a certain kind of technology, I'm all in. But when we can begin to take it when we can begin to sort of do the studies and do the work, I think it's important to do the studies and do the work. I'll give you another example. There's a wonderful scholar of reading, Marianne Wolfe. And Marianne Wolfe is to reading kind of what I am to conversation. I mean, she's like all in for reading the way I'm all in for conversation. And I tell the story in Reclaiming Conversation of how she goes to on vacation, and every few years she takes with her the books of Hermann Hesse, her favorite author. And on vacation, she has like the time and the freedom to read these books. And one summer on a Greek island, I think, she brings the glass bead game, and she opens up the book, and she discovers that she cannot read the book. She has lost the ability to literally read a novel. And she panics, and is it like some kind of early onset Alzheimer's? Her mind goes to the worst things, and it turns out that it's only because she's been reading so much online and so much kind of quick stuff and links, and that she just has lost the ability to concentrate and read a novel. This is like the high priestess of novel reading, deep reading. She studies deep reading. So over the course of 3 weeks on vacation, she retrains herself to read novels. Now, I mention this story because I think, we know about the plasticity of the brain. We know that we can change the way we think by what we do. And I think it's just very important that as we're, developing technologies, I call them intimate machines because they touch so deeply. We are developing technologies that touch so deeply on how we think, how we feel, how we relate to each other, that we show the humility that are we okay with maybe growing up a generation that won't have the patience to read a novel. If we're not okay with that, we have to step back and conserve that in some way. Because I think it's not going to happen by itself. I think left to our own devices, there are things we're going to lose that perhaps we want to keep.
Left to our own devices, so to speak.
Left to our own devices. Yeah. And I think that these are questions that, in the same way that recent studies show that if we were at a table at lunch and we put a phone on the table between us, is a very famous experiment, two things would happen, even if the phone was turned off and turned down on its side, kind of in an off position and clearly not being used, is that the conversation would move to more trivial matters because nobody wants to sort of be reminded that we could be interrupted at any point. And the two people in the conversation feel less of an empathic bond with each other, feel less of a commitment and stake in each other.
Maybe in the recent book, in Reclaiming Conversation, you do talk a lot about the importance of face-to-face conversation, the face-to-face interaction. And this is a case where it's not necessarily in comparison with replacement. It's not just person interacting with machine, but the importance of interacting in person as opposed to just interacting with other people online. Maybe speak a little about the importance of that in-person interaction as opposed to the mediated interaction.
Yeah, well, there are some things that face-to-face conversation gives. And when I say, face-to-face, let's say, is the gold standard. But I also think voice is, voice-to-voice is very important too. I think the jury is out on Skype for the moment is that in Skype, I'm just going to mention a little technical thing about Skype that perhaps all of you are working on when you go back to your offices, is in Skype, in order for, Mitch and I were just discussing this, in Skype, if we were Skyping, in order for you to have the illusion that I'm making eye contact, I have to be looking at the camera, which means I'm looking at nothing, so you can think I'm looking at you in the eye. So I'm having an experience of nothing so that you can think I'm having an experience of something. So really, we're having none of the experience. Yeah. So I can't get very misty about Skype in terms of bandwidth of communication. So what happens in a face-to-face encounter is that you get to, for example, in an apology, is that I get to see, you get to see if I'm apologizing, if I'm sorry, contrite. Do I look sad? And I get to see whether you look softened by my being unhappy that I've made you unhappy. I actually get to see if I've hurt you, which I may not have realized. So there's this, and then you get to see that I'm unhappy that I have, and you soften, and I sense that, and I see my opportunity that maybe something new can happen. So when children apologize face to face, they're learning empathic skills of reading faces, learning how to tune to another person's feelings. That's an experience that you can't just, well, we'll skip that and just have them hit I'm sorry and hit send and expect that they'll have those skills. So my emphasis on face-to-face is really because you develop, when you learn to do face-to-face apology, just to take one out of many examples, you're learning skills of empathic encounter, reading faces, that you just are not available with I'm sorry and hitting send. There's another example I use in Reclaiming Conversation about a family where the 13-year-old son would often be asked to go to dinner at his grandparents on Thursday night. And, you know, he had football and hockey, and he just was often busy, and he would just sometimes just started to, you know, just before dinner say, I'm busy, and send an email, he was busy. And the mother finally said, listen, when you want to cancel on your grandparents, you have to call them. And when he started to call them, his grandmother would say things like, but, okay, you know, I'm making, you know, the roast is in the oven, and your grandfather, in this example, the grandfather used to make these elaborate ice cream sundaes, and he would hear what he really was able to forget when he just was, I'm not coming, that he was desired and that there were people who loved him and were attending him and waiting for him. And he really told me that he just wasn't, like, aware. So
it's another one of the ironies where in an age of hyper-connectivity, there's less of a certain type of connection.
Yeah, and so that's really my pitch. It's not the magic. It's that there just is a skill set and an awareness set that I don't think we want to miss out on.
I also find it interesting the way, although the book is about conversation, which is a social interaction, you also talk about the importance of solitude, and
yes.
that there's an important role in understanding things and
yes.
developing of identity, and how that plays in with your ideas about conversation.
Yes, well, actually, I think this is my most important message, because a lot of people say, well, okay, Sherry Turkle wants me to put away my phone when I'm with other people. I get it, you know. But why does she care if I'm on my phone when I'm alone? You know, why is that in her job description? You know, why does she care about that? You know, and I really do. And here's the argument: is that the capacity for empathic relationship, the capacity for relationship, really begins in the capacity for solitude, because your ability to gather yourself and know yourself and be alone with yourself means that when you sit down to talk to somebody else, you're in a position to hear what they have to say, instead of needing to project onto them who you need them to be in order to sort of fill up your fragile sense of yourself. So the capacity to be a self and to have a self that can be alone is really where the capacity to be in relationship begins. There's a very famous study in which college students were asked to sit alone without a device and they were asked, could they do it for 15 minutes? They said, sure, but after 6 minutes, they were self-administering electroshocks rather than just sit alone by themselves. And we are losing the ability to just be content without the kind of constant, steady stream of being stimulated by the outside. So actually, in the psychoanalytic tradition, there's a great phrase that if you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. If you don't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. And what that really tries to capture is that the capacity for mutuality, for relationship, for conversation begins with the capacity for solitude and self-containment. And I think that's really my most important message, because that is really what our devices risk undermining. But not if we don't let them. I mean, in other words, I don't think the problem is in our devices. I'm very pro-technology. I'm just also pro-conversation. So it's not that I'm anti-technology, I'm pro-conversation. That's how I would put it. And there are ways of using your devices where you don't let them interfere with your capacity to be alone.
So in some ways, this event in some ways is very supportive. We're having conversation here, we'll be engaging others in that conversation.
Yeah.
At the same time, we're having this Twitter feed behind us all the time.
But I love this.
People
look at this.
Probably,
people, but look at how nice. But look at how nice. So these are the words that we're using most. People, human, messy, I love my words. It's like.
Or these are probably the words from the tweets, I assume. Is that right?
Or no, these are the words from us.
It's probably the words from the tweets. But people are probably retweeting some of the things you said.
Madrid,
they're probably tweeting some of the things you said. So it's
Madrid, sketch right? Cool.
Yeah. It's nice that Messi is up there.
It's nice that Messi up there.
Yeah. But in what ways do you think it is a little different for people joining us here, the fact that they were attending to that as they were attending to our conversation?
Well, I think that's for them to say.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's for them to say. I don't usually give talks where there's like this other stuff in the background. I don't know how I'd be interested in how it is for you, whether.
Well, maybe there's a good time to open up.
Maybe it's a good
to the
time
audience
to
talk
open
about
it up.
that or any other thing.
Whether it's
so.
making. I mean, I turned to look at it. I mean, I just realized it's in front of me. But when I looked at it, I think I'm brilliant looking at the things. I would have become fascinated by looking at the clever things that Mitch just said here.
I appreciate that you're attending to me rather than the screen in our conversation. But yeah, and I think there's a microphone that's going around. So if you could talk to the microphone so it can in the video feed.
Hello, and thank you so much for this talk. I am actually researching the idea of memory. So in a way, if you think about just what we were saying, being in a room, having the conversation, but also tending to our devices and recording this. My question is, in the old times, think about Proust. When he talked about memory, he talked about...
Excuse me, when who spoke about?
Marcel Proust, and how he thought about memory.
Uh-huh.
So he was talking about things that happened in the real world, so to speak. Now our reality is both virtual and real and a mix of these things. So I'm just wondering what comment you'd have on what is happening to our memory and what that means. I mean, does it mean, because memory is being talked about in different ways, both in terms of what we remember and also in terms of, what's memory data. I think that they're both kind of thrown around as the same thing. I suspect it's not the same thing. And it has a big effect on our experience, and it has a big effect on ourselves, our sense of identity. So any comment on that?
Do you want to comment? Or? Well, I think that memory is becoming obviously a much more problematic notion because we have, speaking for myself rather than taking it to the social theoretical, the reason that it panics me to be without my computer is that my computer has become my memory prosthetic. The history of my emails is the history of my relationships in a way that feels, people used to have letters But I don't just have letters. I have like daily correspondence and finely textured interchanges with students, with colleagues, so my memory so much resides, and I'm so attached to parts that I've externalized. Now, I don't think that that is necessarily, I think that is how it is, because we now have a memory prosthetic that is going to be, that is how it is. But when you take it to the next degree, and I certainly interviewed a lot of the beta testers on Google Glass, and they really were thinking about glass as a way to not have the burden of memory, and spoke of it very explicitly that way. And there, I think that needs, a different kind of reflection. The same as thinking about getting rid of the burden of all those books and all those rooms and all. Do we really want to be unburdened of the need to remember because we have our lives available, and because. What does it mean that we begin to talk about memory as a burden that now we don't have to deal with because we can have our life accessible at any point? So I think it's both how we think about memory as well as the technological possibility of having this enhancement because you have this prosthetic. If I make myself clear, that I became what I had always taken for granted, that I have this memory. It was like you were saying, is it just an extra thing? But it never occurred to me, well, then now I don't have the burden of needing to remember because my memories are so cherished by me. But then in the course of doing my research, I did come across people for whom glass was a kind of technical solution to a problem that they wanted to solve, which was the burden of memory. So it's a great question.
Hi, yeah. Thanks for the talk. I'm Sasha Chak. I'm an associate professor of civic media here at MIT, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about. You've been describing some of the your take on the impacts of these technologies in a sort of universalized way. So these are things that happen to all of us as we engage these technologies, while technology access is still sort of deeply unequal, right? And so I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the ways that differential access to technology might be structuring and reproducing inequalities, especially along sort of class, race, and gender lines. And I'll give you an example that I think really links into the way that you're talking about and thinking about technology. I was showing a class of mine the other day this startup called HomeJoy, which has since been acquired by another firm, but it's like an Uber for domestic work, so house cleaning. And the marketing campaign for the app was all about how younger wealthy people in San Francisco needed to have their homes cleaned, but were really uncomfortable with the idea of talking to someone who was going to clean their house to do this. And so the whole marketing campaign for HomeJoy literally showed sort of a Latina woman cleaning a bathroom while a white young male sits in a computer in the next room, never having to have an interaction with the woman. So the whole point of the campaign was just click a button, someone will appear and clean your house and disappear.
This is a perfect example of what I'm calling the downside of the friction-free life. And why do we want the friction-free life? And why am I so afraid of your putting on virtual reality glasses so you don't have to go to Ferguson? You just have to put on virtual reality situation and be as though you're in Ferguson, but you don't have to go there. But it's very empathically and compassionately fantastic because of this. because our fantasy is that we will live a life where we don't have to really talk, experience, sit down, have a cup of coffee, and know anything about the person who's cleaning our house or who actually is living in Ferguson, and go into their house and talk to them. So in a way, this is a perfect example of what I mean. I'm going to give you another example that will seem much more frivolous, but makes the same point about friction-free. Since I think this critique of the friction-free is somehow the way to get at this. I went to one of the first demos of the Internet of Things. And I forget if it was in this building or another building like it, but it was in like a building something like this. So they're demonstrating the Internet of Things, and in the demo, I'm shown how it's incredible, and one of the great things about the Internet of Things is I'll order my cappuccino. I like the cappuccino decaf, skim milk. It's going to be waiting at Starbucks. Plus, my phone will be able to guide me on a route in which I'll be able to avoid, let's say I live in Cambridge and the world is very small, any ex-boyfriends, ex-lovers, ex-friends with whom I've had arguments. So the good life is not just having the cappuccino ready. God forbid I should have to go and like order it, and but it's actually having a route in someone's imagination. Since what matters here is what our technological imagination is that technology is here to help us live a life where there's no rubbing against people you've had a fight with or a difficult moment, or the Latina woman who cleans your house, because you wouldn't want to talk to her. It's better to just push a button and have her appear as though she is a benevolent genie. And I really feel that this is that is there's something about this fantasy of virtuality that is pushing us in that direction. So I mean, taking your question in that direction, but I think Mitch on the education issue. I mean, there's so much inequality in the way in which educational resources are.
Well, no, then the inequality issue always takes on new forms, because it used to be just inequality of access to the technology, but even as there's growing access to technology, then people get access to different forms of technology, different support for how they make use of the technology. So we get to see the types of creative use of technology that we try to support to engage people in developing as creative thinkers get embraced in certain communities and not others because of those divides. So I think the divides show up in multiple forms.
Yeah, I mean, there are many studies that of the creative, kind of creative uses of technology being distributed in upper class homes, and then other people are playing games. But it's not, it's something that it's not the tech, it's not, it really isn't the technology. It's how it's used.
First, you mentioned letters and emails. I found a box of letters from when I was in college in the late 70s a couple of weeks ago, and I can tell you the letters affected me more than any email I've ever seen, looking back at people's handwritings and things we were talking about back then. But I'm a user experience consultant, and I was talking with one of my clients this morning, and we were talking about forming a community or studying people to better form a community in the discipline of computing, which is what they work in. And it made me think about your book and the people who are so involved with their devices and maybe have been connected or thinking they're connected with people all the time from when they were very young, and how professional societies are seen by those people. Do those folks really see the need for professional societies the way that we might have when we were in graduate school or first starting to work, or do they feel that they're already as connected as they need to be, and so those societies are not as useful to them?
Well, I think it's hard to, I think it's hard to say about the issue of how they see professional societies will have a lot to do as to whether or not they meet these professional societies online. I mean, people, that old John Nesbitt, high tech, high touch, seems like a very old phrase, but we're seeing people who have a tremendous desire to go to meetings, to go to events, at the same time that we're seeing disconnection and use of social media and and the phenomena of people emailing the person in the cubicle next door. At the same time as you have that, so this is not exactly on professional societies, people stream to events like TED. I mean, but it isn't just TED. It's South by Southwest or hundreds of different kinds of gatherings to be with each other. And those kinds of events, where people kind of gather, those are seeing greater attendance too. So I think that you have that the story here is not clear about how people want to be with each other. It's a very, I think it's a complex story. I begin reclaiming conversation. Actually, the statistics came out after I finished the book, but I often, in my thinking about where we are now, I often begin with the statistic from the Pew Foundation that 89% of Americans began their last social interaction, or in their last social interaction, took out a phone, and 82% say that when they did that, it deteriorated the interaction. And that's a sort of feel where we are now with, are we doing everything online, or are we in professional societies? Is that 89% of us are taking out a phone in our last conversation, and 82% of us are saying that it deteriorated the interaction. That we want to have something that we're doing something and we feel we're losing out as we're doing it, and we want to have that thing back, and sometimes the easiest way to have that thing back is physically getting together. So I think you're seeing a yearning.
Well, in some ways, I think we probably have to develop better understandings of what we get from each of these forms of interaction, because we clearly get something from both of those forms.
Absolutely. So
like in our work with kids,
Yeah.
In this online community we have of kids, the Scratch programming community, obviously kids are online interacting all of the time. There's 100,000 comments a day on each other's projects. But we also have Scratch days where they come together and meet in person, and they love coming together to share ideas, work together.
Exactly.
And they get different things from each of those experiences.
I think this is really the point, is that there's no simple story about replacement. I think if everybody takes two things, the two most important things for me are the story about solitude and relationship going together, and the second really thing is that this fantasy of replacement just needs to be undermined. There's no reason for it. You're developing incredible things. They're just as magical and just as life-enhancing, and if they don't replace anything wonderful that we have and just take their place as new, magical, wonderful things that will enhance experience. It's the fantasy of replacement. Better than anything becomes, better than nothing becomes better than anything that has ever lived. And the art is to figure out how to, I once said, that we need to talk about it, but we're like young lovers who are afraid that too much talking will spoil the romance. That's how I find technologists, that it's like you're afraid that too much talking about the problems with technology will spoil the love affair. I mean, it's time to talk. I mean, it's not going to take away the fantastic beauty of technology to talk about the problems or the limitations or the downside. So I'm optimistic that as the technology matures, people will be more willing to talk and not feel as though they have to get into this fantasy of replacement or of everything else has to go.
So the segue to that might be that how do, in this quantified world, how do people strike that balance between, on one hand, the technology and the interactions of, just like here, we're in person and also on the webcast, there's a balance between having the conversations and having digital interactions, having the scratch days versus the scratch, working with computers. Where's the practical sense of, okay, this is how much you should be in person, this is how much you should virtualize your relationships. How there's a guideline that needs to be somehow set, no?
I think it comes from, I think it's going to come from experience and from regaining our kind of equilibrium. In other words, one of my, if it's author's choice and I get to say the sentence in my work that I like best, it's technology makes us forget what we know about life. Technology makes us forget what we know about life. It's my favorite line in my book. Because I think we know that, when I interview a father who's giving his child a bath, and he knows that when he gave his younger children baths, he used to talk to them during the bath, and he tells me how these were the most important conversations because they set the groundwork for his lifelong relationship with his daughters. And now he has a 2-year-old, and he puts her in the bathtub, and he does his email on his iPad while she's in the bath. And he looks at me and he says, I know this is I know this is wrong, but this is what I'm into now. I think that with experience and taking a step back, and with designers helping us, really designing tools in the technology that make it easier, a tool that says bath time, and you just hit, seriously, just making it easier and easier for us to segregate and, draw kind of bright lines around our activities, but making that sort of the default, easier and easier for us to to put the technology in its place. We're going to act on those intuitions because we're going to come back to the kind of balance that Mitch is talking about. Fantastic to have these kids interacting online, and also fantastic to get them together on the days when they get together. Because he's had, 30 years of experience doing it, and he's watched, I'm sure there were years or times in his program when there was erring on one side and then erring on another, and just over time you get to see the balance. And I think that what's happened is that a generation of parents, what I've observed is that a generation of parents grew up smitten with their phones, and it really is the parents who are texting at breakfast and texting at dinner and have their kids tugging at their sleeves. And now it's the children who are saying, you come to games and you don't look up from your phone when I'm making the play. You're not paying any attention to me. And there's this generation of sort of 13 to 15-year-olds who are saying things to me like, when I have children, I'm going to raise them not the way I was raised, with parents texting at breakfast and dinner, but the way my parents think they were raising me, which is in a house with conversation. So I think that we're going to, I'm optimistic. I think that we're going to remember what we know about life and come back to ourselves. And I think technologists and designers are going to be the kind of biggest stakeholders in that, because I think that people are going to start to demand it, and you're going to start to want to give them a better life with technology. It reminds me of diet. I was raised in a household where my mother adored me, and there wasn't really a question of not having enough money for food. But when it came time to serve fruit, I was served this thing called Fruit Bits. It was from a can, Del Monte, it had like heavy sugar syrup, and one of the fruits was maraschino cherries floating around in these Fruit Bits. I don't know if anybody else had fruit, but I see people laughing. Anyway, that was fruit. If I had given my daughter this particular fruit item, or any of her friends. I mean, I would have been shunned. This was not, it was like not going to, even if they weren't doing cursive writing, they knew that this was not fruit. And, American consumers just began to say, this is not, we'd like to see some fruit in the supermarket. We'd like to see, that's not healthy. And I think that in general, diets have gotten better and healthier, and we expect a different kind of diet. And I think we're going to want to have a different kind of digital diet. So I'm optimistic.
So so putting our phones down. I'm over here. Putting our phones down is definitely the cheapest and best solution. But here in the Media Lab, we like expensive, complicated solutions. And so I kind of wonder if there are roles for technology in advancing some of the things you call for. For example, a technology that would increase the likelihood that I would run into my exes on my way to my coffee. Or a technology that would let me jump into someone else's point of view when they're sort of in Ferguson being attacked by the police. Or a technology that would, when I'm in a particular place, give me access to information about that place that I would otherwise not be able to access or not be able to see or hear or feel because of all of this information that's kind of invisible. Is there a way that technology could be designed to make me more empathetic as opposed to make me feel like I'm being empathetic? Or is it always going to be a simulation that's going to make me distant from the physical world, or is there an alternative?
I don't want to say that there's not that technology. I don't want to say that technology can't enhance your experiences of other places and other people at all. I mean, movies, television, theater, and now virtual reality. These are all, experiences, theatrical, that are empathy enhancers. So I didn't mean to take virtual reality out of that trajectory. But in the theater, in conversations about the theater, I don't think we're so quick to say, let's go to the theater and then, we won't have to talk to anybody. That'll be like a replacement somehow for something. It's like, that will be the beginning of a new kind of dialogue and a new kind of curiosity to go there and to be there and to have a conversation that will embolden me to have a conversation with someone different. So when I think about a virtual reality app, it's like it should be something that increases the possibility of your wanting to then go there, join the Peace Corps, go there, as opposed to the discourse of, well, you'll do that so you won't have to go there. So I guess I'm studying at this point more the conversation that I hear around the app as opposed to the app itself. I have nothing, this isn't a critique of the technology itself. It's a critique of the kinds of fantasies we build around what the technology is going to enable us to do. So I want to hear about, this is a virtual reality app, that makes people more likely to want to go to new places and have new conversations and have new experiences, as opposed to, if you do this, you don't have to go or talk or be. So I think maybe it's a good distinction to make about what my critique is. It isn't at all of the technology itself. It's somehow about the discourse that we so easily slide into about the technology.
Do you think it was much different with the earlier types of technology one can imagine with photography, we see pictures of elsewhere in the world, say, well, you don't need to go there anymore, you have the pictures.
Right.
Or reading books, when books became popular, that was there some of the same issues that arose of people falling back to those technologies of books, of photographs? And do you think the current situation is different in a fundamental way, or just or along a similar trajectory?
Well, I think that our fantasies now, no, I think there is definitely this is the continuity. I think though that we are in a position to learn from what we have had before, and learn that actually reading about it and having and being there turn out to be very much not the same thing. So and now we have a technology that's so much more powerful and so much more seductive. I mean, my example would be in terms of attention, that if Mitch and I were at lunch, the chances of my saying to Mitch at lunch, just hold on a second, I have Madame Bovary here, a book, and just give me a minute, I just want to read for a minute this chapter where, Emma is,
That's unlikely, although
Yeah.
parents reading the newspaper at the breakfast table probably might be similar to looking at your email at the breakfast table.
But we take out our phones and interrupt each other in a way that we don't give ourselves permission to do with books in the course of normal discourse. And I'd like us to just, get to a kind of norm in the way in which we don't divide our attention to each other that we've gotten to with books.
We treat it the same way as we treat
Yes,
books.
I think you should treat your phone the way you treat a book, is that when you're actually talking to somebody, you don't interrupt it to catch up on a book. So we've learned from the world of books that it's better not to read a book when you're in a conversation with another person, no matter how compelling the book. And I sort of feel the same way about your social media feed. You get more out of the conversation if you don't. But I mean, to get to this point, I think that the issue is really about the fantasy of replacement. I mean, that's really where I want to draw attention. It's not to the power or the interest or the compellingness or the beauty of this new technology. It's about what is there about these technologies that bring us to fantasies of replacement. And if we've learned that fantasy of replacement isn't in our best interest, how can we tamp it down? And I guess I'm voting for they're not in our best interest.
Hello, I'm Joy. I'm a student here at the Media Lab. And I was just wondering if fantasy is the seduction of technology, is attention the seduction of conversation, or does conversation mature into something else where it doesn't necessarily need to be seductive?
Does conversation need to be seductive? Well, conversation is often not seductive because conversation can be very tough. I think the reason that technology is seductive is because technology does when there are silences. When I ask people, what's wrong with conversation? Why do you prefer to text rather than talk? And by text rather than talk, I mean email or Instagram or Snapchat, everything that keeps you behind a screen. There's one guy who says to me, conversation, I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you can't control what you're going to say. That's what he hates about conversation. And he's right. That's really what's bad about conversation. This is not 100% fun.
Whoever designed that clearly didn't know what they were doing.
Mitch could ask me anything. It's taking place in real time. I don't know what you're going to say. I could, and on the other hand, you sort of will get to know me more by watching this, because you get to see where I stumble or where I fall silent or where I am not so sure. And that reveals me to you. I haven't been like 100% smooth talker through the entire thing, and you get to see where I'm not, clearly I don't want those libraries to go. I'm not happy when all the books are gone, but I don't have a real smooth answer for why. I'm not happy. But obviously it's a problem for me. I don't think we're ready to get rid of the books, like gently with the books. You get to know something about me as a person and sort of what I'm struggling with. It's been a lifetime. It's interesting. So I don't think it's ease of use that makes conversation the value. I think that it's something else about getting to know other people that isn't necessarily ease of use. This friction-free thing just keeps coming to mind. I think that the value, the technological values are always somehow about easy, fat. What was Rodney's expression? Fast, cheap, out of control. Sort of easy. I love this example of the app where you get a helper, you get somebody to work for you, but you don't have to deal with the fact that they're poor or the fact that they're, that you have to talk to them, and you have to, you just sort of tap a button and they're there, like they're from Harry Potter land or something, where they apparate. Or people who just kind of come and fix things for you. I think that this friction-free notion, and I think conversation is like exactly the opposite of that. You have to deal with a whole other person, and they could get upset, and you could realize they've had a bad day. And then one thing, I talk to people about why they don't like conversation, and they say, sometimes I'm in the middle of a conversation, the person just has had a meltdown, and they've had a terrible time, and all of a sudden they're talking about their sister and how, and I don't want to, and you realize that they're trying to instrumentalize their relationships, and having the whole person in front of them it's harder. But if that's your value, you want to make sure that you keep some of those conversations going.
So first of all, I'm really struck at the fascinating topic. And I'm noticing, as I'm sitting here, that there's a lot that I want to say that the people on the Twitter feed get to say. So because I'm sitting here, I don't want to be rude and take out my phone, but I could. Or alternately, I could have stayed in my town and watched the webcast of this lecture, but instead I made that decision to kind of bump my way through Boston, get lost, find parking, make sure I had enough quarters, find my way to the MIT Media Lab, and come to see and see you both in person. And I'm having a different experience than the people who are sending out tweets. And I'm noticing the words and the phrases that are coming up that are sort of the most used words. And I'm thinking, hey, that would be fun to be a part of that. But also I'm enjoying this. And so I guess I'm noticing in myself a paradox of, on the one hand, being glad for all of the people that I rubbed elbows with on the way down here. On the other, I could be in my pajamas at home watching, on a webcast. So I just wonder if you could just talk to that a little bit, of the desire that I have to communicate required that I waited. I had to be patient until the mic came around to me. And there's so much that I want to say. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about that. How can I be a better participant in this incredible environment and with such a great conversation?
But I think it's kind of interesting that that we sort of have both here, and it's kind of, what is the experience of having both? I get to, I don't get to respond to the Twitter people. I get to respond to you. I don't know. What do you feel about being here versus being? Yeah, give her the mic back. I think that it's obviously if you're on Twitter, and if you're on Twitter, you get to if you're home on Twitter, you can also, be watching Downton Abbey at the same time too. I mean, does Lady Mary marry that handsome guy at the end, or what's going to happen? So plenty of people. There's so many screens that can be open. So, what is your experience of?
I would say I'm having a. You described it as a distinct. Parallel realities, and I'm having that experience where on the one hand, having Twitter would be great because I could comment more often on thoughts that are coming up and enjoy the feedback from other people who are also on the Twitter feed. On the other hand, I'm learning patience, so that's a good thing. So, and of course enjoy just the personal interaction. I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Actually, I suggest this might be, it is around 4:30 now,
Yeah.
It's been an hour and a half, and maybe we'll take this opportunity to end, but if you can stay a little while longer, we could talk with the people here, give them an extra advantage of people who stayed home with their pajamas. So we'll sort of say
Seems
goodbye
fair.
to those people.
I just want to say
but-
that this has been, if this is the end, this has been really such, I want to thank Mitch for reading these books. For being such an incredible colleague over the years, my absolutely best student ever, and for doing this,
Well,
really.
it's been great. It's been great having you here, and look forward to more interactions with the community here. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all.